time we talked about different types of learners and learning modalities. We talked about the types that are most susceptible to having learning problems. Today, I'd like to talk mostly about the VKA student. So if you haven't watched the previous videos on how kids learn through their senses, please do that, and then you'll understand what these symbols VKA stand for. Now this VKA learner is going to be strongest on their creative visual side, weakest on the analytical spectrum, and then their kinesthetic or tactile modalities will be their bridging modality. So a VKA learner who is well adjusted and within the normal realm, in the realm of normalcy, you would have the V, the K, and the A all within the realm of normal. Where we get into problems is when the visual field is so active, so busy, that the child can't even focus. They live in a daydreamy visualization world. They're always visualizing things. It's the kids that are like always trying to call back to reality. So, and then the kinesthetic will be somewhere in the normal range typically, but then if you have the auditory down in the low range where they're not perceiving sound correctly, or they're not, not doing a good job of processing sound, then you get a real imbalance. But even if you have a child who has this sort of a picture with the auditory in the normal realm, but much lower, this visual is what we're focusing on here, is where the visual is above the normal range. They're too gifted, so gifted that it becomes a disability for them. Again, these are the children who are going to be most often labeled either ADD, or in our current labeling system, ADHD without the H, so to speak. But basically not attention deficit, but not hyperactive. And then you have also the dyslexic label. The student might be labeled one or both of those. The children who are visual, kinesthetic, auditory are at most risk for those labels. In the book, The Gift of Dyslexia by Ron Davis, and I'll link to that below. This is a great read if you can get through it. It's not that it's a difficult read, it's actually a very easy read, but I found it very difficult to read it the first few times that I tried to get through it. I think because Ron Davis was dyslexic, and so he thinks a little differently than I do in my very sequential world. So anyway, Ron Davis has really done some great work and has a good program out to help dyslexics. He describes this child who is born with the tendency to be visual-spatial. I'm going to be paraphrasing this, and it's been many years since I read the book, so it's a very loose paraphrase. But he talks about the child who's even just very, very young in their crib, and they see the hand of their mother come around the door to their nursery, and they see that hand, and they're able to envision the rest of the person behind that hand. Whereas most of us would just see the hand, and we would see that there was a hand, and we might not interpret what was behind that hand, or we might not at least be able to envision it, even though we might logically know that a person is behind it. The visual-spatial child is able to visualize the person that goes with that hand, even though they don't see that person. He goes on to say that that child spins things around in their mind. Again, a very loose paraphrase, but the way I describe it is the visual-spatial gift works very well for the young child. They can imagine things, they can fill in the gaps of things that don't exist, they can remember everything by picture. They'll take a picture in their memory, they might have a photographic memory. So they're very gifted, but when they go to school, if this visual giftedness is outside of the normal range, is too busy, then they're spinning things around. They have a hard time distinguishing letters and numbers because they spin them around. So, does the 3 go this way? Does the 3 go that way? A 2 looks very much like a 5 if you just tweak it a little bit. Of course, the 9 and the 6. So they go to read the word cat, and the teacher puts up on the board C-A-T, cat. And the student goes, well, that doesn't look like a cat, but maybe if I spin things around, it might. What if I put the A this way, and let's see, I'll put the C here, and then I'll put the T this way. Well, maybe that looks like a cat. Or maybe I could do it this way. Maybe that looks like a cat. And they start moving letters in their mind because they don't realize that they aren't supposed to spin things around, letters around, like they've been spinning everything else around. So they can't tell the difference between a B, a D, a P, and a Q without the tail are all the exact same shape, just all in different directions, right? And so they can't, because they're spinning everything, if they try to go and read the word Bob, they don't know if that's Bob or Bop or Dodd or Pop. They don't know because they're spinning everything around in their mind. A most dramatic story of that was with a student. She was about 10 years old, I believe, and she came in to tutoring with me, and I was using an exercise like this in those days, and she was supposed to put her hands on the shoulders and show me the direction of the tail and say the name of the letters. And this is a variation of an exercise found in the Audioblocks program. She had a terrible time doing this exercise. It was so hard that her mother was practically in tears watching her daughter, who was well of the age that should know a difference between a P and a B, struggle so much with this exercise. And remember how I mentioned that the problem for the visual kinesthetic learner, the VKA learner, is when the visual is too active, right? And then the others are, either here or down here. Her visual was too active. It was spinning everything in her mind. And so what we needed to do was tone it down, to tame that visual skill and bring it into the normal range. Once that happened, everything became easier for her. And so within just about 2 or 3 lessons, she came in and she was able to do much more difficult levels, maybe about this level of an exercise, where she was able, P and Q and D and B, and she was able to show me the directionality of each of those as well. So I said to her, how come you can do that exercise now? And she said, well, it's easy. I said, well, what's changed? She said, well, no one had ever told me before that I wasn't supposed to spin letters. It's not like the student knows they're spinning letters. They think that what they're doing is normal. And we as parents or teachers or tutors or other professionals don't realize they don't know that. We don't realize oftentimes that they're spinning letters. And so we don't think to tell them that, right? So she said, no one had ever told me before that I wasn't supposed to spin letters. And so now that I know, it's much easier. For the child who spins things. Life is very confusing. Whenever they go to read, they have to try to figure out what direction letters are supposed to be in. When they go to write, they have a very hard time finding the line to write on. They're like, where's that line? Because for them, the line could be it could be waving. They're like, whoa, because it's moving, right? Or it could be, where do I write, And they also don't perceive the sizing of their letter correctly. So, you have the child who makes a large letter and then a small letter, and and their spacing is very odd and that sort of thing, because their visual perception is off. And at the end of this video, I will link to another video that helps to explain why kids who are visual-spatial often have problems with handwriting or dysgraphia. Another problem that we have for kids like this is that they store information in their brain in that same spatial way. So they might store information like this in kind of a clump. And that's great when you're taking a little snapshot of everything around you. So the child who remembers tiny details of the past, don't you remember Grandma has that pretty vase on her bedstand? And everyone else is like, I don't remember that. Or they're the ones who always finds the keys that are lost, because they've seen a little tiny bit of it poking out, and they have this picture they've taken. Oh, don't you remember your keys on the piano under that cloth? Taking pictures of things is a great way to remember things. There also can be the child who has a photographic memory if they learn to read. So, but what happens is, the reason they can't remember normal things, like you say, they can remember little details of the past, but they can't remember the math fact or the spelling word that I drilled with them all week. The reason for that, in my opinion, is because they're storing things in a clump like this. And so when they go to find information, they can have a hard time. If what they're looking for is near the top of the pile, they need a green block, it's right here. But if they're looking for a piece of information that's hidden, they have to start digging in their brain, and then they get distracted by the things that they find in their brain, and they never get to finding that black block because it wasn't near the top. So that's part of the problem with why they get distracted and why they can't remember things. So like, if the information is still near the top of their brain, then they can probably find it. But if it's mixed in and all cluttered up, they're going to have a hard time remembering it. So what we need to do in that case is we need to help the child learn to organize their brain so that they can find information quickly and easily. So that's the biggest problem for a child who has the visual perception weaknesses, is that they're not able to sort information. And that's where that sequencing skill is so important. And remember, that was on the other side of the brain. Then the visual-spatial, that sequential and analytical side, was on the other side of the brain. So then they can't find what they want. And now when it's organized, when they learn to organize information, they can readily find it in their brain. Another example that I like to use is going into the library and pulling all the books off the shelf and making them into a great big heap. And when you do that, then you go and you would tell the child, find these 3 books and these specific books. And so they go to look for those 3 specific books. And if one of them is near the top, they start digging. The ones near the top, they find it. But they're going to keep digging and digging, and they're going to get distracted as they're trying to find those other books because they're in this big heap. But again, if we organize those books on the shelf and we teach them how to use the system of the library, then they say, those 3 books, I know how to find them. Here's one, here's another, here's another. and they pull those books readily off the shelf. And so that's the way it is for the child when we teach them how to organize their brain. They can go in and easily pick out the information they need, and they don't get as sidetracked. Another aspect of this is that the auditory is very weak typically in these kids, or it can be, and the weaker it is, the more problems that the kids will have. So let's say it's near the bottom or even below the normal range. Then what happens is, because auditory is weak for them, and auditory by nature is sequential, we always listen to the foreground auditory. Anything in the background we are supposed to tune out and listen to that sequential auditory. So because they're weak auditorily, the more auditory input that comes in and sequential information that comes in, they get overloaded so quickly and they just tune out and go into their spatial world. So going back to the image of those two hemispheres, the left being the auditory and the right being the visual, when we give them too much input into the auditory sequential side of the brain, it gets overloaded and they switch over to this side and just shut down and go into their daydreamy, spacey world. So keep that in mind to make sure that when the child is doing a lot of sequential or auditory work, or if they have to listen to the teacher a lot, be sure to give them frequent breaks, and also utilize this bridging sense. If the child is allowed to have a squeeze ball under the desk, or something like that, they will be able to listen longer than they can if you just expect them to sit still and not do anything. It doesn't have to be distracting, but it can be something that will help them deal with that. The hope for all this is there are exercises that we can do to help the child overcome this disability. We can tone down that visual spatial misperception that they have, and if they have weak auditory as well, we can teach them how to improve that area too, and then they come into the normal range and they're able to succeed much more readily in their academics. Now, if you're wondering if your child is a visual spatial learner, your child personally or your student, there are some screening tools that I can give you as well in another video. So with that, I just encourage you, if you like what you're seeing here, please hit that like button. If you want to see more of these videos, hit subscribe. If you want to be a part of the community that I'd like to build up, definitely subscribe. Let's work together to make learning easier for children.